What if the wisest man in history lost everything? He was chosen by God, crowned in glory, and blessed with unmatched wisdom. Kings sought his counsel. Queens traveled across deserts to hear his words. Under his reign, Jerusalem shone with gold, and the temple stood as a beacon of God's presence. But behind the splendor, shadows grew. 1,000 wives, foreign gods, altars of fire to idols that devoured the innocent. The voice of prophecy warned him twice, but he would not turn back. The kingdom's unity began to crack. Forced labor, heavy taxes, and betrayal poisoned the people's hearts. Enemies rose, friends became rivals, and the man who once judged with perfect clarity could no longer judge himself. This is the story of Solomon, his rise, his reign, and the fall that split a kingdom. What if I told you that the wisest man in history made a mistake so disastrous that it destroyed his kingdom? Solomon had it all: divine wisdom, unfathomable wealth, and God's favor. But his story ends tragically. How did a man end up at this point? Tonight, we will unravel the whole story of Solomon, his ascent, his reign, and the decisions that brought him to ruin. Stay with me, because this isn't just a history lesson. It's a biblical warning. Tell me your name, city, and the time you're viewing this in the comments section before we start. I'm curious as to who has assembled here in pursuit of the truth. Additionally, the description includes a link to the complete Bible, which includes all 88 books as well as the Book of Enoch in English. Let's move on to Solomon's tale, where human frailty, strength, and wisdom all come together. One question hung over the kingdom as David lay dying in Jerusalem, his once powerful body failing. Who would take his throne? According to ancient custom, Adonijah, the oldest surviving son, should inherit the throne. Tall, good-looking, and used to luxury, he had already started to behave like a king, assembling chariots, horsemen, and followers. However, God frequently disregards human expectations. When Adonijah proclaimed himself king at On-Rogel, Solomon, the son of Bathsheba and the 10th son of David, was not even there. With the exception of Solomon and the prophet Nathan, he invited all of his brothers to participate in the sacrifice of sheep, cattle, and fattened calves. This was a calculated move, not a mistake. Nathan understood the significance of Adonijah's coup. He rushed to Bathsheba with a warning: Solomon and his mother would be targeted for execution if Adonijah assumed the throne. They visited David's chambers together, where the elderly monarch was still holding on to a vow from years ago. Solomon was the chosen heir, Nathan reminded him. A last-ditch effort to gain legitimacy ensued. Before Adonijah's supporters could respond, David gave the order to take Solomon to Gihon Spring, anoint him with oil from the sacred tent, and publicly declare him king. As Zadok, the priest, poured oil over Solomon's head, trumpets sounded. "Long live King Solomon," the populace yelled as they cheered. When the commotion reached Adonijah's feast, the guests dispersed in fear. They toasted a new king 1 minute, and then their uprising fell apart. In a cry for forgiveness, Adonijah ran to the altar and clutched its horns, with the caveat that not a hair of his head will fall to the ground if he shows himself a worthy man. Solomon's first decree spared his brother's life. However, he will perish if he is found to be wicked. Why did God pick Solomon instead of his brothers? His name, Solomon, which is derived from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace, holds the key. David was born soon after he repented of Bathsheba and Uriah, and his life was a broken king's cry for peace. However, there was more. God had promised David an enduring dynasty, a line that would culminate in the Messiah centuries before. That covenant was based on divine faithfulness rather than human merit. However, Solomon's early deeds exposed hidden traits. Solomon honored David's charge: "Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways." Solomon exhibited restraint, a quality uncommon among kings, when faced with the opportunity to establish his rule through bloodshed, in contrast to Adonijah, who pursued power through alliances. The throne was not safe, though. Solomon's benevolent postponement of dealing with Adonijah would prove to be costly because his ambition was still simmering beneath the surface. Jerusalem hummed with doubt as Solomon's brow was overed in oil. Now the youngest son was in charge, and while his power was supported by divine promise, it was put to the test by rivalry whether this untried ruler could retain the victories of his father. The bigger question, though, was whether Solomon would use his unexpected inheritance to further justice, or if the weight of power would corrupt him as well. There was an issue at the start of Solomon's rule. Since the temple had not yet been built, sacrifices were still made on hilltops with altars, some of which were Canaanite in origin. Solomon worshipped at these mixed places despite his love for the Lord. The most important was Gibeon, where the ancient tabernacle was located 6 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Solomon brought 1,000 burnt offerings there one evening. The smoke of sacrifice curled into the dark as the king lay down to sleep, and God entered his dreams. That night changed everything. The Lord appeared to Solomon in a vision and said, "Ask what I shall give you. No restrictions, no conditions, a blank check from the universe's creator." Most kings would take advantage of the opportunity and request endless wealth, a long life, and victory over adversaries. But even heaven was taken aback by Solomon's response. "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, so that I may distinguish between good and evil." Wise leadership requires neither wealth nor power. God found resonance in the request. Solomon got what he wanted, and more, because he hadn't asked for anything personal. God said, "I give you a wise and understanding heart, so that none like you has arisen before, and none like you shall arise after." However, the gifts didn't end there. God promised wealth and honor beyond all kings without any questions. Solomon would also live a long life if he walked in obedience. The dream then came to an end. When Solomon awoke, the world was the same, but everything had changed. He went back to Jerusalem and continued to offer sacrifices in front of the Ark of the Covenant. His newfound wisdom was soon put to the test for the first time. 2 women who claimed to be the mothers of the same child arrived at his court. There were no witnesses. One child was dead, while the other was still alive. Each of the women asserted that the living boy belonged to her as their voices rose in accusation. After listening, Solomon took the unimaginable action. He commanded, "Bring me a sword." One woman nodded grimly in agreement, saying, "Divide the living child in 2 and give half to each mother." The other went to her knees, pleading with the king to spare the boy, even if it meant losing him to her rival. Solomon saw the truth then. He ordered, "Give the child to her who begged for his life. She is his mom." Israel heard about the verdict. Realizing that this wisdom was more than just human, the people were in awe. Officials observed as Solomon's choices demonstrated depths of understanding that training could not impart. He had a strange understanding when he talked about nations, trees, and animals. No king who sent envoys to test his knowledge was unconvinced. But there was still tension beneath the surface. Divine expectations accompany divine gifts. Solomon's wisdom wasn't a prize, it was a tool. His reign's success or failure would depend on how he applied it. Already it was becoming harder to distinguish between personal ambition and loyal leadership. The elevated areas remained intact. Some were sealed with marriages to foreign princesses, while others formed alliances with neighboring kingdoms. For now, the world was awed by Solomon's wisdom. But it would take more than wisdom to prevent a kingdom or a heart from shattering. The man who could resolve the most complicated conflicts still had to deal with a problem for which no amount of wisdom could adequately prepare him. Self-rule. His path was set by the dream at Gibeon. No heavenly vision could make decisions for him about what when the court fell silent. Days apart, both had given birth in the same home. Each woman claimed the living boy as her own, while the other child died in the night. Midwives were unable to testify. There were no witnesses to what transpired in that shadowy room. The child whimpered as the women's cries reverberated throughout the palace, only 2 frantic voices yelling, "He is my son," and "No, He is mine." Solomon looked at them, one crying with red-rimmed eyes, the other holding the baby in possessive rage. The king said, "Bring me a sword." Like a blade, the command sliced through the argument. The guards gave Solomon a shining weapon after he hesitated but complied. The crowd gasped as he repeated, "Divide the living child in two. Give half to one, half to the other." The women froze. One woman's face hardened as she nodded immediately. However, the second woman collapsed to her knees, her voice shattering, saying, "Neither of us will have him then. Cut him in half." "Give her the child, please, my lord, but don't kill him." Solomon saw the truth then. A mother's instinct is to give up a child rather than watch it be destroyed. He gestured toward the woman who was crying. As the court erupted, guards dragged the infant from the first woman's arms and said, "Give her the living child. She is his mother." Realizing her cruelty had condemned her, the would-be thief staggered back. This was not just a shrewd legal ploy. Solomon had revealed the truth about the child's birth and the type of love that took him. A true parent's selfless love was demonstrated by the mother who pleaded for the boy's life even though it meant losing him. The other showed possessive jealousy under the guise of care, preferring to see him split in two rather than lose control. Like fire, the news of the judgment spread throughout Israel. It was whispered that such truth was beyond the comprehension of the average mind. Envoys sent by distant kings to confirm the rumors were astounded by Solomon's wisdom. He became so well known that even the Pharaoh of Egypt heard stories about this king, who was endowed with divine wisdom. But beneath the genius was a more profound lesson that Israel needed to learn. Between genuine devotion to God and phony religious pretense, the two women reflected the nation's struggle. Israel would later embrace false gods while professing loyalty to Yahweh, just as one woman pretended to be a mother while covertly harming others. His inability to discern between genuine faith and meaningless ritual was hinted at by Solomon's judgment. But for the moment, the king's wisdom shone brightly. Even the weak were given fair hearings in his court, which turned into a lighthouse of justice. For days, widows and orphans traveled to present their cases to him. Visitors noticed an eerie quality in Solomon's eyes, as though he could see right through their words to their hidden intentions. His legend was solidified by the tale of the two mothers, but it also established an unachievable benchmark. When the temptations of power became more intense, could even the most shrewd man remain so clear-headed? The secret of the women's hearts had been revealed by Solomon. Who would break the king's own heart under the pressure of compromise and crowns? That was the bigger mystery. Solomon watched them leave as the real mother sobbed and held her child. The crowd applauded, but nothing showed on his face. Already burdened by choices far more significant than this one, he turned back to the throne. On the marble floor, the sword that had validated his wisdom was still shining, serving as a silent reminder that not all conflicts could be settled so neatly. Solomon's wealth was Amaris connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia, the incense from Arabia and the copper from Edom were already under the control of the kingdom he inherited. Solomon, however, turned Israel from a fork in the road into an empire. His initial action? Alliances for marriage. Peace with Egypt was solidified when the pharaoh married his daughter. Princesses from Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and other places followed. Each bride brought yearly tributes, lands, and the right to trade. Like water, gold poured into Jerusalem. According to the Bible, Solomon received 666 talents annually, or roughly 25 tons, from ordinary taxes alone. However, his true wealth came from trading. He established a fleet at Ezion-Geber on the Red Sea in collaboration with Hiram of Tyre. These ships came back from Ophir, which may have been in present-day India or East Africa, every 3 years with gold so pure that it was used to cover the interior of the temple, almug wood, ivory, apes, and peacocks. The amount of consumption was astounding. 30 measures of fine flour, 60 measures of meal, 10 fattened oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, plus deer, gazelles, and poultry were needed daily by Solomon's household. Warehouses were filled with grapes from his vineyards, and chariot horses were kept in 40,000 stalls. In Solomon's time, silver was worthless, so visiting dignitaries gaped at drinking vessels made of solid gold, palm tree columns, and carvings of lions on thrones. But there were unstated expenses to this luxury. Solomon established mass labor drafts to construct his projects, which included the temple, palaces, and fortresses. Israelites labored for the crown for 1 month out of 3, either quarrying stone or cutting cedar in Lebanon. Conditions were worse for foreign subjects, who worked as enslaved laborers. Grain from farmers. Heirs was diverted to royal store cities. The northern tribes were especially angry about having to pay for Jerusalem's opulence while their infrastructure was in ruins. A paradox resulted from Solomon's economic policies. His wealth shattered Israel's social cohesion while making it a world power. The king amassed 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, directly contravening Deuteronomy's prohibition against assembling military power, despite Proverbs' warning against greed. His renowned wisdom turned into a commodity as well. The Queen of Sheba would soon arrive with camels loaded with gold and spices to test its value. The biblical story is supported by archaeology. Elaborate ivory carvings at Megiddo and Samaria match Solomon's descriptions of his palaces. There is still evidence of industrial-scale production at his copper mines in Timnah, which are now in southern Israel. Digging further, however, reveals simpler homes collapsing under ash layers, indications of a population struggling under taxation. Over the course of 7 years, 183,000 workers were employed by the temple alone. Discontent simmered outside while its inner sanctum glistened with gold. Prophets later cited Solomon's excesses, how many suffered for the extravagance of one, when denouncing injustices. His rule demonstrated that prosperity is brittle when wisdom is detached from justice. Solomon's wealth and its consequences became legendary. When compared to his wealth, the sayings he wrote about moderation seem ironic. Jerusalem's citizens left burdened, while visitors left awed. Although gold was used to pave the temple floors, it undermined public confidence. This disparity would destroy the kingdom in a generation. The world, however, marveled for the moment. Like ordinary stones, silver lay abandoned in the streets. Rumors of a ruler whose majesty overshadowed all others were brought by merchant ships. However, the radiance of prosperity frequently causes its architects to become unaware of flowing, but his greatest weakness was not empty money, but rather the hearts of his people, which grew heavier with every golden levy. More than money, his architectural aspirations demanded loyalty, and that money was running low. The workers' resentment solidified alongside the mortar as stone after stone was raised for his next big project. His greatest accomplishment would be the temple, but it was built on a foundation that was already beginning to show signs of weakness. David had desired to construct a home for God. Because the warrior king had spilled too much blood, God rejected the gold, silver, and bronze he had collected for the project. Solomon would now realize his father's ambition. The task required sacred precision in addition to resources. Every material and every measurement had significance. The temple would solidify Israel's identity as a nation founded on divine promise, rather than as a collection of nomadic tribes. Solomon turned to Tyrian King Hiram. Cedar beams cut by Phoenician woodsmen and carried down the coast on rafts were obtained by their alliance from Lebanon's forests. The limestone from the hills' quarries was so exquisitely polished that no hammer noises could contaminate the holy place while it was being built. The clay molds of a talented craftsman, also called Hiram, whose mother was from Naphtali and whose father was a Tyrian metalworker, produced the bronze artifacts. The building was shaped by workers for 7 years, and the inner sanctuary was covered with pure gold by artisans. Beneath the carved olive wood, cherubim with 30-foot wings protected the ark's resting place. The temple was designed similarly to the tabernacle, but it was larger and constructed according to celestial specifications. Before golden lampstands, incense burned on a porch that led to the cred, space. The Holy of Holies was the most revered area beyond that. Once a year on Yom Kippur, only the high priest was allowed inside. The entrance was flanked by bronze pillars known as Jashin and Boaz, which stood for power and divine establishment. Priests washed in the courtyard's molten sea, a huge bronze basin supported by 12 oxen, and sacrifice altar. Solomon gathered Israel's elders for the dedication after the work was completed. Priests carried the ark in while offering innumerable sheep and oxen as sacrifices. The king then extended his hands in prayer. He acknowledged the paradox in his words. Will God really live on earth? Solomon understood that the temple was more of a gathering spot and a center for prayer than it was God's home. Even heaven cannot contain you. When he was done, the offerings were consumed by fire that descended from heaven. The priests had to flee as a dense cloud engulfed the sanctuary. The Lord's glory was back. For 14 days the populace feasted. They were in awe of God's presence as well as the gold and grandeur when they left. His loyalty to David's line was demonstrated by this house. But the beauty was not without danger. The gold and bronze might turn into idols in their own right, symbols mistaken for real things. Priests may put ceremony before morality. Solomon's prayer even alluded to Israel's possible exile if they turned to other deities. Daily sacrifices were still being made at the temple, but tensions were already building. Tribes in the north had been strained by the labor drafts. Although Phoenician artisans performed miracles with metal and stone, their pagan beliefs quietly crept into the court. The glittering gold structure served as a warning and a monument, illustrating what happens when human success triumphs over divine will. People traveled from far, and we eyed to marvel at its splendor. However, walls could not contain true holiness. Prophets would proclaim centuries later that God preferred justice to sacrifice lifeblood, but its devastation demonstrated that even holy objects can have negative effects. But for the moment, the cloud of glory persisted. Solomon's golden masterpiece appeared to last forever. However, when it comes to human hearts, permanence is a myth. The temple was still standing, but the hearts that were supposed to worship it were already floating away. Through traders and diplomats throughout the Arabian Peninsula, rumors of Solomon's wisdom spread outside of Israel. A queen in the kingdom of Sheba, which is probably Yemen today, listened with skepticism. She was the ruler of a wealthy, literate country that dominated the frankincense trade. Why should she trust stories about a new king's divine wisdom? She set up a caravan with camels bearing gold, precious stones, and spices in order to test him. The fun 200-mile journey passed through rocky terrain and deserts. This was a royal audit, not just an idle curiosity. When the queen arrived in Jerusalem, she presented Solomon with riddles, which are thought to be difficult questions pertaining to philosophy, nature, or government. Although the Bible doesn't mention specifics, she was thoroughly questioned. Solomon had all the answers. He was not stumped by any riddle. She looked at the robes of his court official, the attentiveness of the servants, and the magnificence of the temple as they conversed. The directive that there be no corruption or resource waste was the most notable. The queen who arrived for the test was shocked. She acknowledged, "I was not told the half. Your prosperity and wisdom are greater than what I've heard." Their gift-giving had political significance. She handed over 4 tons of gold and a lavish shipment of spices that no Israelite had ever seen before, possibly containing the enigmatic balsam oil that would later be valued in temple ceremonies. Scripture does not specify the nature of Solomon's lavish gifts, but he returned the favor. According to some interpreters, these interactions suggested closer ties, such as a partnership between their trading networks, or even romantic conjecture that was later investigated in Ethiopian custom. Solomon's reputation around the world was solidified by the queen's visit. This demonstrated that his knowledge was not regional. It impressed a ruler whose culture was on par with Egypt's. In her final remarks, she praised Yahweh for using justice to establish Solomon's throne. However, beneath the praise, her presence revealed weaknesses. Why did Solomon require approval from foreign rulers? He was already bound by political concessions because of his marriages to the pharaoh's daughter and others. Forced labor was used to finance the wealth she admired. Legends about how they met have been preserved by ancient Jewish tradition. According to some, She used artificial flowers as a test to see if Solomon could distinguish between real and fake flowers. According to another, she challenged him to tell the difference between nobles and commoners by bringing children who were all dressed alike. Although unconfirmed, these tales demonstrate how the experience became legendary, a standard for questioned wisdom. Her visit probably paved the way for Solomon's Red Sea fleet to access African gold and Arabian spices in the past. However, there was irony in the queen's surprise. She worshipped the sun god Shams while praising Yahweh. A pagan ruler who was on the verge of idolatry through political marriages was awed by Solomon's divinely endowed wisdom. His spiritual integrity was being shattered by the same diplomatic skill that had impressed her. The queen probably told stories about the beauty of Jerusalem when she got home. According to the Kebra Nagast text, she gave birth to Solomon's son Menelik I, who established a dynasty in Ethiopia. Jesus would later mention the Queen of the South rising at judgment to punish those who disregarded wisdom superior to Solomon's. Solomon reached his pinnacle when foreign rulers recognized Israel's superiority, which was her visit. However, it also hinted at decline. A web of compromise was being woven by the very alliances that brought such prestige. The kingdom's heart would soon turn away from the God who bestowed its splendor, and chariots and palaces would become more important than justice. Unaware that she had caught a glimpse of Solomon's brilliance as well as the fissures beneath the gold veneer, the queen departed with camels loaded with presents. Some must have remembered that day when the perceptive eyes of Sheba saw the truth more clearly than the king of Jerusalem, and Solomon's marriages later caused him to turn his heart to foreign gods. A kingdom built on crumbling foundations cannot be sustained by admiration from a distance, and wisdom recognized is not wisdom lived. In retrospect, the visit that solidified his legend also signaled the moment when domestic devotion started to lose ground to international acclaim. A harem of political alliances, Solomon's palace was home to 300 concubines and 700 wives. Peace with the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, among other neighboring kingdoms, was guaranteed by each marriage. However, there were restrictions on these unions. Princesses from other countries brought their gods. Within sight of Jerusalem's walls, the king who constructed the temple of Yahweh now permitted altars to stand for Ashtoreth, Molech, and Chemosh. Initially, it appeared to be practical. Kings' daughters required shrines. Solomon made accommodations for them, justifying it as a diplomatic move. In order to appease Chemosh, the destroyer god who required child sacrifices, Moabite women burned incense. Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess, was worshipped by Sidonian wives through temple prostitution rites. Molech worship, in which Ammonite priests held infants in bronze arms draped over fire pits while drums muffled their cries, was the most horrifying. These were not covert activities. Across the valley, temple incense mixed with smoke from foreign offerings. This is precisely what God had forewarned against. Because it was predicted that they would turn away from Yahweh, Deuteronomy's law prohibited marriages with pagan nations. Solomon was aware of the orders. He denounced idolatry in his sayings. However, he remained silent while witnessing the delivery of Jerusalem's children to Molech. Once able to sense a mother's love, the king was now unable to recognize the danger. Gradually, the erosion occurred. At first, Solomon only allowed these altars for the convenience of his wives. Then, out of respect, he went to ceremonies. Last but not least, the Bible makes it clear that his wives turned his heart after other gods. He constructed elevated sites east of the Mount of Olives, one for each idol. The man now bowed before statues after praying for wisdom to rule. Solomon received warnings from God twice. The first served as a reminder. Don't worship other gods, or Israel will be torn from you. The second was more pointed. Your kingdom will divide, but not in your lifetime, for David's sake. Mercy persisted even in judgment. Solomon listened, but did not change his ways. Once totally committed, his heart now wavers in its loyalty. It was a startling contrast. He was in charge of the sacrifices at Yahweh's temple during the day. He participated in pagan rituals at night. The king's contradictions were discussed in whispers by courtiers. Because this was Solomon, the sage ruler who had uttered 3,000 proverbs, priests were reluctant to chastise him. However, wisdom that is not bound by obedience was praised by international diplomats. Its cosmopolitan air astounded traders. Elderly people who recalled David's rule lamented in the meantime. They had witnessed the ark being carried into the city while dancing. Molech's fires were now glowing in the distance. Solomon's fall was neither as dramatic as David's adultery, nor as abrupt as Saul's disobedience. A series of concessions defended as statecraft, it was slow. Every wedding alliance appeared to be sensible. Every shrine seemed innocuous. The man who had walked with God abruptly lost his ability to recognize him. Misplaced loyalties were the root cause of the kingdom's disintegration. Forcible labor for southern construction projects was already a source of resentment among the northern tribes. They now witnessed their king embracing gods that ate children. It would be betrayal, not just taxes, that would cause division. Whether Solomon personally took part in child sacrifice is up for debate among historians. Scripture is vague. Solomon followed Ashtoreth and Molech could imply approval or participation. In any case, his silence made atrocities possible. The most intelligent man on the planet joined the madness. Uncomfortable questions are raised by his story. How often do we overlook minor concessions that undermine fundamental beliefs? At what point does cultural accommodation turn into surrender? Although Solomon's marriages brought about peace during his rule, they also sowed the seeds of destruction that would outlast him. The kingdom was intact outside for the time being. But beneath the surface, cracks grew. Though its creator's heart had wandered, the temple remained intact, and the twice-spoken God would not issue another warning. In the wings, represented by 10 disgruntled tribes and a disobedient servant named Jeroboam, was judgment. Civil war would be the result of the drift that started with political marriages. Solomon's heyday was coming to an end, with the soft hiss of incense at alien altars rather than a battle cry. When God issued his last warning, the altars to Molech and Chemosh were still burning. Solomon had disregarded earlier warnings, but this one was so vividly described that no one could ignore it. One of Solomon's officials, Jeroboam, was stopped by the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite on a road outside of Jerusalem. Ahijah did something startling as Jeroboam walked by himself. He ripped his new cloak in half. Grasping the frayed cloth, he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10. For the sake of David and the holiness of Jerusalem, only one portion of the kingdom, Judah, was preserved when the Lord declared, 'He will tear the kingdom from Solomon and give you 10 tribes.'" It was a specific prophecy. Solomon's worship of foreign gods caused God to split Israel. However, Solomon's lifetime would not see the fall of judgment. For David's legacy, mercy persisted. Solomon's kingdom, however, would fall apart. Ahijah clarified that the dissatisfaction was already sown by Solomon's policies. Rebellion was unavoidable due to forced labor, high taxes, and religious compromise. The prophet even identified Jeroboam, an Ephraimite who oversaw projects involving forced labor, as Solomon's successor. Jeroboam wasn't chosen at random. He had personally witnessed the animosity of the northern tribes. In his capacity as an overseer, he had seen families split up for Solomon's building projects. Now, if he stayed faithful, God would make him king over 10 tribes. The ripped cloak was a test, not merely a prophecy. Would Jeroboam repeat Solomon's errors or learn from them? Solomon learned of the encounter. He ordered Jeroboam's execution out of fear rather than repentance. Jeroboam, however, escaped to Egypt and took refuge with Pharaoh Shishak. Solomon's rival now harbored Egypt, with whom he had formed an alliance through his marriage to the Pharaoh's daughter. His kingdom's fissures deepened. This moment is regarded by historians as a turning point in both politics and religion. Although Solomon's reign was characterized by wealth and wisdom, injustices persisted beneath the surface. While Judah enjoyed privilege, the northern tribes were forced to shoulder the majority of the labor demands. People listened to Jeroboam's promise of lighter burdens. The injustice Solomon permitted was matched by God's punishment, which wasn't random. The ripped cloak represented more than just separation. The founders of the tribes, Jacob's sons, were remembered in 12 pieces. God's intended unity was broken by tearing them apart. But grace persisted even in judgment. In order to uphold the messianic promise, Judah would remain under David's line. Despite abuse, the temple would remain, for the time being. Solomon's deterioration was evident in his response. To govern justly, he once sought wisdom. He hunted a man God had selected, and now he ruled by fear. The king who constructed the temple was unable to demolish his idols. The prophecy was fulfilled because he was unable to alter his course. Jeroboam watched Solomon's health deteriorate while he waited in Egypt. The beauty of the kingdom concealed its vulnerability. 10 tribes on the verge of seceding. They would reject Solomon's heir, Rehoboam, and support Jeroboam after his death. Solomon's decisions had set the stage for the division, so it wouldn't happen overnight. Solomon's last years are shadowed by Ahijah's prophecy. Nothing was changed by the king. At Molech's altars, sacrifices persisted as officials discussed succession in whispers. Solomon's legacy was no longer safe because his shortcomings overshadowed his wisdom. It was not too late for redemption, but it was too late for repentance. King Hezekiah, Josiah, and eventually the Messiah would come from the remnant of Judah. God maintained hope despite discipline. Solomon, however, had already suffered the harm. Once completely devoted, his heart had cost him his people's unity. More than just fabric, the ripped cloak represented the disintegration of a kingdom. The northern tribes bore the brunt of Solomon's aspirations. The hills of Ephraim and Manasseh were scarred by forced labor quotas, while Jerusalem shone with gold. 30,000 Israelites left their vineyards and fields each month to work one-month shifts in the quarries of Judah or the cedar forests of Lebanon. Under the watchful eye of Egyptian taskmasters, foreign overseers Solomon used to optimize efficiency. They forged metal, hauled timber, and cut stone. Their complaints were ignored, and their wages were not paid. The land was drained dry by taxes. Officers gathered a set amount of grain, oil, and livestock every year, not only for Solomon's table but also for his 12,000 horsemen and 1,400 chariot teams. While farmers' children went hungry, store cities like Megiddo and Hazor were overflowing with confiscated produce. 12 district officers, each in charge of providing the palace with supplies for 1 month of the year, made up the ruthlessly exact system. Tribes in the north became aware of Judah's exceptions. Like an untended wound, resentment festered. Solomon upheld a legal separation between foreign and Israelite workers. Survivors of the Canaanites were forced into slavery and forced to work in chains on building sites. Despite being technically free, the Israelites had to deal with corvée, a forced labor draft that caused generations of family strife. Mothers wept as their sons vanished to work gangs, despite the king's justification that it was national service. Jeroboam, an Ephraimite who had risen to lead Solomon's labor corps, swore around campfires and witnessed the mangled bodies being dragged from fallen quarry walls. 3 complaints, overworked men, stolen harvests, and neglected infrastructure, became the focal point of dissatisfaction. Northern roads collapsed as Solomon enlarged Jerusalem's walls and constructed palaces for the daughter of the Pharaoh. Saul's simpler reign, when kings did not confiscate vineyards for royal officials, was recalled by tribal elders. Few people from the north could afford pilgrimage offerings after taxes, so even the temple's glory sounded hollow. Reluctantly, Jeroboam became their champion. 10 tribes tore away like ripped fabric, according to Ahijah's prophecy, which he remembered. Solomon's decision to order the labor superintendent's execution after learning of his popularity backfired spectacularly. Pharaoh Shishak welcomed this adversary of Solomon's court when Jeroboam fled to Egypt. He heard of growing unrest from exile. Now the tribes in the north were organizing, not just whining. Solomon's disconnection was evident in his response. He poured oil on smoldering resentment by tightening northern quotas and increasing Judah's privileges. Reform-minded officials were demoted. Retaliation for workers who disrupted construction sites was swift and severe. Solomon continued to add weight despite the crumbling foundation of the kingdom by taking on more projects, wives, and idols. The irony was later noted by historians. His paternal shortcomings were invisible to the king who made the decision between two mothers. The simplest principle of divine wisdom, that a divided house cannot stand, was disregarded by the man who received it. His policies violated covenant loyalty in addition to burdening people. Solomon went beyond all boundaries despite Yahweh's warnings against overindulgent ruler, as 1 Samuel 8. In Egypt, Jeroboam awaited his opportunity. The elderly monarch was deteriorating. The break would occur under Solomon's heir, according to prophecy. Tribesmen stocked caves in the hill country with weapons. They would soon demand terms, and 10 tribes would secede in a single day if Rehoboam refused. The lines of fracture were deep, not only between north and south, but also between people and palace, justice and wisdom. Solomon's rule would end in quiet desertion rather than conflict or overthrow. The rebels who destroyed his empire would be the same laborers who built it, and the crown, which was once brilliant in the Mediterranean sun, would soon rest uncomfortably on the forehead of a divided kingdom. However, the greatest tragedy was spiritual rather than political. Molech's altar had been built by the same people who had placed the ark in the temple's hall of holiness. The king, who was endowed with divine wisdom, opted for oppression rather than justice. His legacy would be the disintegration of David's united kingdom, thread by severed thread, ripped apart like a Ahijah's cloak, rather than the beauty of the temple. Restless shadows surrounded Solomon's last years. The man who once enchanted nations with his wisdom was now pacing palace halls and observing the strength of rebellion. As his kingdom fell apart, his body grew weaker. Molech's altars continued to smoke in the valleys beneath Jerusalem. Northern tribes whispered treason, and Jeroboam waited in Egypt. A monument to what might have been, the temple was plated in gold. There was a startling difference between Solomon's early and late reigns. Now, the youthful monarch who prayed to God for wisdom clung to idols. The leader who once arbitrated conflicts with extraordinary foresight ignored the pleas of his subjects. While his policies fostered justice, his proverbs praised righteousness. Solomon's legacy was in disarray, despite the fact that court poets continued to be anchored by 3 books. Ecclesiastes wrestled with the pointlessness of life, Proverbs compiled his sayings on living a moral life, and the Song of Solomon extolled the passion of love. Together, they create a paradox, timeless knowledge written by a man who disregarded it. Solomon amassed wealth despite Proverbs' warnings against greed. Despite Ecclesiastes' declaration of vanity, he pursued meaningless grandeur. Despite his devotion to foreign gods, the song exalts exclusive devotion. When these works were written is up for debate among academics. Did Solomon write Ecclesiastes as an elderly man, regretting years of wasted life? Was the song a preemptive tribute to his first love before his feelings for 700 wives became hazy? Only the eerie discrepancy between wisdom expressed and wisdom lived is addressed in the texts themselves. No solutions are provided. The trajectory of his decline was predictable. He was isolated by power. He was numbed by luxury. He was blinded by compromise. Despite his ability to solve riddles for the Queen of Sheba, the king was unable to reconcile his contradictions. 2 divine warnings were ignored, proving that even God's patience had its limits. The repercussions were now imminent. Solomon's last actions were defensive. He purged rivals, tightened his grip, and readied his son Rehoboam for a throne that was already crumbling under its own weight. In 931 BCE, death arrived in silence. The wisest king in history passed away with little fanfare, only a silent succession crisis. Along with his father's errors, Rehoboam inherited the throne. Tribes in the north demanded relief from forced labor within a few days. 10 tribes immediately seceded when Rehoboam threatened to implement harsher policies. To lead them, Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Along Solomon's fault lines, the kingdom that David united was divided. The biblical story is supported by archaeology. Solomon's stables in Megiddo later burned down in rebellion. Shortly after Solomon's passing, according to Egyptian records, Pharaoh Shishak invaded Judah, probably taking advantage of the chaos. Solomon's golden shields were melted down to raise money for the war, but the temple remained. Within a generation, his ambitious projects were reduced to rubble. It wasn't just lost territory that was tragic. It was wasted potential. Solomon's wealth and wisdom were unmatched by any monarch, past or present. However, his talents were insufficient to make up for his disobedient leadership. He permitted the sacrifice of children while constructing Yahweh's house. While imposing oppression, he wrote sayings about justice. Deuteronomy's caution that knowledge without obedience is dead wisdom was echoed in the lesson. Strong contrasts can be seen in Solomon's story's conclusion, with the temple standing tall while the kingdom crumbles and sage advice enduring its creator's shortcomings. He was a mystery even in death. Was Ecclesiastes his last admission? As his lungs failed, did he silently confess his sins? Scripture doesn't specify. The only result we are aware of is a divided country, a damaged legacy, and a warning engraved on the remains. The king who had everything died holding on to nothing. His spiritual authority was undermined, his unity was broken, and his wealth was pillaged. The books were all that were left, testaments to a light that shone on everything but his soul. Following the uprising, Rehoboam dispatched tax collectors to the north, but they returned with nothing but blood. The workers who constructed Solomon's empire now erected barriers to keep out his successors. Unintentionally, the wisest man's last lesson was that integrity cannot be replaced by wealth or knowledge. The trust of a kingdom's citizens, not its treasury, is its real foundation. Long before he was out of breath, Solomon faced hard realities. This man built God's temple but worshipped idols, unified a kingdom but divided it unfairly, and received divine wisdom but disregarded it. His life poses the question, what good is knowledge without integrity, or authority without empathy? Every day we are put to similar tests, when ambition overrides conscience, when wealth suggests we should have more, and when success tempts us to compromise. Solomon's demise was gradual. It resulted from little decisions that gradually damaged his character. It's your turn now. Which of Solomon's lessons most resonates with you? Post your comments below.